read most of it. It's going to be a lot of fun. There are things I learned in that book from my teammates that I had no idea. Almost every single guy was interviewed. There's going to be a lot of different perspectives on that season, a lot of different stories. And I think fans are really going to enjoy listening to and reading about that season. It was such a memorable moment in my life and in Michigan fans' lives that it's going to be a big hit.
There is Jon Jansen from yesterday's show saying that the book of the 97 season that is coming out later this summer is going to be a big hit. Not a surprise there, but one of the co-authors of that book from The Athletic, Nick Baumgardner, joins us here on the Maize and Blue Reviews. Good afternoon, Michigan football. Nick, how are you? Are you surprised that Jansen was so enthusiastic about, proclaiming that it was going to be a big hit?
Yeah, I am a little surprised that that he learned things. I got to tell you, that's impressive. I think I'll have to tell Mark that. That's a pat on the back. We talked to John, I want to say it was around the 4th, and I think is when he got a hold of it, and he was saying he had some time off to read it. So that's cool. I haven't actually talked to him since he read it, so that's the first I've heard. So that's a great review. But yeah, John was great, and he nailed it. I mean, we did talk to, we tried anyway, Dennis, to get a hold of, I think, every living scholarship player. That's essentially what we tried to do. Some guys, were harder to reach than others, but we got a lot. I mean, we got a good chunk. I don't know what the percentage ended up being, but it was more than 100 people, in the whole thing. We got a ton of time with Lloyd. And I think that helped a lot. We had a ton of time with Lloyd, and he was as open as I think he's probably ever been in any interview session. It was 20 hours that we sat with Lloyd over the course of, a long time. So I think that helped a lot of the guys open up, because I think we came to them with, hey, we know about this. And they were like, oh, okay, so let's talk about it. And so there was a lot of things like that popped up, but it was a lot of fun. And those guys are awesome, as you know, Dennis. I mean, there's a lot of great people that not only have played on that team, but coached and were just around the team in general.
Yeah, well, you weren't asking them about a low light, man. You're asking about.
No, man, this was a fun book. There was nothing bad about this one. This was the best year of your life. This was like, in so many ways too, like that season, I think for a larger audience than just Michigan, so many people, I grew up in Michigan. I remember that team so well. But I think for a larger audience, that team was like somewhat formational of the college football that we see now. It was the last year of the non-playoff, more or less, the BCS, which wasn't a playoff, but I mean, it's the precursor to what we have now. And it was just Woodson winning the Heisman. It was a disruptor. And, the other thing, Dennis, I think we learned that's reported in this book is the transition from Moeller to Carr was pretty fascinating. And a lot of it people don't really realize. And I think people will maybe be a little surprised to learn how close Lloyd was to probably being out of there a few times, not before 97. So that stuff I think is also interesting in this book.
Well, you mentioned, we know who Lloyd is, Lloyd Carr. You mentioned Mark, that's your co-author, Mark Schneider, who helped you out with this book. Yeah, I think about the transition in 95 where, Lloyd, took over for Gary Moeller. And then those 2 seasons, while Michigan beat Ohio State, which was a huge highlight.
Right, yeah.
They went down to Ohio State and I think won 13-7, something like that. But heading into the 97 season, I do remember back when, you had the magazines, it was the Sporting News, and they had the block M. The M stands for mediocrity. And, Dan Pompei, who would end up being famous for saying that the Lions were going to the Super Bowl right after that. He was also, I think, remembered maybe infamously for saying that, the M was for mediocrity. And that it wouldn't surprise me if Lloyd had that particular Sporting News, all over, Schembechler.
There was a few. There was a few. And I think that the other cool part about this was, Mark was Gene Myers, who was the editor of the Free Press for even longer than either Mark or I covered the team. So our perspectives really varied on this. And I think we tried really hard. We talked to some other people outside of, some people that were in the media at the time. We talked to Doug Karsh, guys like this. I mean, people that could get us a perspective on how the program was perceived at the time. And it was very, very different, I think, than people probably realize or probably maybe quite remember all the way. I think a lot of people's memories will be jogged in some ways, and that, you had that seismic. Schembechler retires, you go on to Moeller. The first couple of years of that are really encouraging, and they're bringing in just insane levels of talent, which this program has never duplicated to this day. Some of these recruiting classes they put together in the 90s are ridiculous, on par with anything anywhere in the country. And they could not get it together, and they could not put one foot. It was the 8-4 stuff. Cook making fun of them all the time. Yeah, I mean that was the perception. People were not thrilled, obviously, after the Moeller situation. Nobody really wanted Lloyd. A lot of guys on this team, some of them have talked about it publicly, some of them haven't, wanted to leave in the 95, 96. So I just looked at it as it was a critical season for Michigan football. I don't know if the program it'd be a big deal, but would it be as big a deal if all that happened the way that it did in 97 today? I don't know. I think it's a very important chapter in Michigan history that really hasn't been explored like this all the way yet.
I talked to Carr during the pandemic. Got his number and we were exchanging calls. And then we talked for a few minutes, and then I said, well, I want to do a podcast with you. He's like, I don't know if I remember everything. And then, we were going back and forth. I said, well, I started talking about a game. Well, then I'm like, you do. I said, you do remember everything. He's like, well, maybe I remember some of it, but I read on a thread that you indicated that Carr recorded his thoughts on all things Michigan football during every practice that he ran for like 10 years. So you talked to him. So were those tapes part of it? What were those conversations like with Lloyd?
Yeah. So the conversations with Lloyd were amazing. And, we really tried to focus so much more on the bigger, like the people, and the book ends up being so much about the people of that team that built the team and the players and their families and all this. But Lloyd's notes are, at the time he tape recorded them. He got the idea from Bear Bryant. I think people may be surprised to learn how much, maybe Lloyd's talked about it since, but he really patterned his coaching after Bear Bryant. I mean, just about every single thing he did included taking notes into a tape recorder at every practice, standing on the field and observing himself, so he didn't forget anything. And then at the end of every practice, he would have a staffer, and it rotated the guys that did it over the years, or shuffled a little bit. The staffer would transcribe it, and then he had them all right there. So we have the transcribed, bullet notes of how he was feeling, from the very first day of freshman practice of 97 all the way through the end of the season. So like that really was a great guide for us, to, if Lloyd would get, I can't quite remember that detail, we would just look, hey, it's right here. So it would be, and that would jog a memory. That helped a lot. And he was great too. I mean, he remembered more, like you said, Dennis. I mean, when you get talking about people with Lloyd, like he remembers more about people that he's met in just random situations. And that's how he was as a coach. And that's why all those guys love him to death. They had the big tunnel thing last year for him before the tunnel was turned into news or whatever, right? When it was named for Lloyd, and a ton of them were back. They had a big reunion, and that's not that common these days. I just don't think it is. And it's a pretty special chapter there.
Nick Baumgardner, our guest from The Athletic. He's got a book coming out, Mountaintop, the inside story of Michigan's 97 national title climb, and Lloyd Carr with the foreword in that book. I see Wolverine fans talking about Michigan's blowout win in Happy Valley in 97 as one of Michigan's best wins. You mentioned Cook. There's some people that might not be old enough to, like, who's he talking about? Cook. It was Bino Cook, who famously that week, I think, said, Michigan, don't bother sending the band.
Yeah. He was like, just send the band. He said, just send the band. Have them play the victors a couple times, and then they can go home, and then the game will just be over. Yes.
Well, Michigan, I don't know, like you always say, hey, can you play at your peak?
Right.
Like, can you have your peak performance in a game? And yeah, you always want to be able to, but that particular game from the first snap, Glenn Steele goes out and, snatches down the quarterback. And, and from there, I think it was pretty much a boat race. Michigan did play their best game of the season, and they overtook. I think they were number 4, and then Penn State was number 3, and they took over as best team. Judgment Day, I think.
Judgment Day, yeah, that's a very big part of the book. That game itself was a huge deal. I kind of with hindsight and talking to everybody about how much went into it, because that was the true test for that team, right? Of like, are you actually going to do this? Are you going to fall apart like you have every single time? And talking back, I mean, with so many people that were part of it, there's a few guys, more than a few, that had said, guys that went on and had careers in the NFL, that they were never part of a game where their team performed better wire to wire, regardless of the opponent, than that one. Like, that was the best big game performance that most of them have ever been a part of. Some of them, obviously Woodson, Brady, these guys played in Super Bowls. A lot of them actually played in Super Bowls from '97. That's another fascinating part of that team. But that game itself, you got the Adrian Taylor hit in that game.
Oh, yeah.
So much about Michigan introducing itself. I think nationally, Lloyd was someone people now knew after that game. It catapulted them. That was early in Nike. Michigan became, I think, a much more bigger national, dare we say, global brand after thrashing Penn State. I think that everything after that, if you lead through Woodson and the Rose Bowl and everything else, it just takes off, and it has never stopped. I mean, they've been this huge deal ever since in terms of branding and everything else. And at the time, that was new, but I think that's what helped kick it off.
And branding and the way you win a Heisman, you've come up big and late in games
Exactly.
late in the season. And Woodson had the touchdown against Penn State, and we know against Ohio State, he had a pick, he had the punt return. So Woodson, it's been 26 years, and there have been a few players. I don't know, Hines Ward. I'd probably be able to come up with some that we're really good defensive players and, tried offense. I think Hines Ward maybe the other way around, but is it surprising to you there has not been another, I don't know about another Charles Woodson, but not a player, a two-way player that has had the impact that Woodson did?
It 1,000% is surprising. And it hit me probably 7 years ago, somewhere in there. It was after he retired, I think, from the NFL, or maybe right at the end of his career. But I was like, well, he's a generational player. He's just one of the best corners that's ever played football, period. It's him, Dion, and I don't know, a couple other guys, and that's it. I think that is what, because at the time, I think you go back and you say, we talked to some other coaches around the country that were like, we're all trying to copy that back then. What Lloyd had this plan for how they were going to practice Woodson and use him and the title. And we're like, well, how did you do that? And no one was able to really figure it out. I think the closest Michigan's ever seen was Peppers, and he was never as impactful as Charles was on either side of the ball. But and that was insane too. All the things that Jabril was able to do. But I think when you look back, you're just like, it was Charles Woodson's one of the greatest football players ever to ever play football. Period. End of story. That team also has Tom Brady, same thing. Steve Hutchinson, same thing. The eliteness and the greatness, and Brian Greasy and guys like this. Brian was amazing to talk to. The elite level at which that team operated without even really realizing it, because that's just who they were, is really, really special. And I think when we talked to Charles, a lot of it was his memories of growing up at Michigan, finding himself, pushing himself, learning how to, fail, and learning how to get back up. And it's and that's why I really, for years and years, Dennis, I mean, there's not that many guys that come around. Everybody comes around, but and Charles is unique, I guess, in that he has a TV job, but every time he shows back up, it is like everybody loves him. He loves the place. It could not be more jubilation. And I think I really learned why, having talked to him for this book, because it was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, we got Nick Baumgardner from The Athletic for a couple more minutes talking about the book that he has coming out on the 97 championship season. And I look back to 97, I was 26 working in Ann Arbor radio. And the first game, Colorado was supposed to be. That's why I think they went to the. Carr went. He read that book from Into Thin Air.
Hour, yep. Mm-hmm.
Hour. I haven't read that book.
That's right.
Picks, and it takes teamwork. But Colorado was supposed to be a big. They were supposed to be. A really good test. This was going to be a real murder row. A gauntlet that they had to go through, and they blew them out. But I remember just how fast the defense looked, just how good overall Michigan looked. They came out with the curtain up, and they're like, "Oh, they look great." But the Notre Dame game, Michigan won, but I don't know if people remember. You probably, now that you've gone over it, I always remember that they turned the ball over 3 times in the second, 3 times in the fourth quarter, and still were able to win that game. You don't win many games like that.
No, that was the first true testament to Michigan's defense being different and something that nobody had really seen here before. I think, and that because they won it completely and totally. They just stole the game on their own, more or less. And most of the offensive guys admitted that. The other factor there that I didn't realize, probably going into this, it was a bigger deal to those guys, was Greg Madison, who had left Michigan, as you'll recall, Dennis, in '96 at the end of the season to go to Notre Dame. And it did not go over well inside the building, as you might imagine in 1990, in the, I guess it would be the winter of 96, 97. It did not go over well. Jim Herman coached the bowl game, and that led to the sort of seismic change in how they played defense. We have a pretty fascinating story from Herman about how they installed the fire zone, where they got it, how they put it together, and how they just sort of turned the whole thing over to the kids. And it was just lightning in a bottle. I don't know how else to explain that one, because that's another one of those where it was right place, right time. We actually talked to Greg for this book, Madison. I don't know how many times he's talked about, that, leaving Michigan and how he felt, how that made him feel, the whole thing. But it was just a fascinating time for a lot of people. And that Notre Dame game was a big deal inside both buildings on both sidelines, way more than I think I realized going into it.
Man, Madison left for Notre Dame, and then he left for Ohio
and
State.
And he left again, Dennis. So,
how about
that's a journeyman, we'll say.
Did anybody bring up, I've never asked Jim Herman, but I've had a couple different people. It's normally been in like bar situations. They've told me like the 97 Michigan-Ohio State game, Herman left his play sheet back at the hotel. And if you look down on the sideline, you'll notice that he wasn't there. He had to get a police escort to the hotel and, coming back, and then you kind of see him entering I don't know if anybody ever mentioned that. If you're talking with people,
look, we've got all that. Yeah, I'm not going to confirm or deny that for you on the show, Dennis. You have to buy the book to read the full story. But we've got, you will have your answer to that question after you read this book. Absolutely.
All right.
Jim was amazing. We talked to Jim for as long as any assistant. Vance Bedford and Jim Herman were absolutely fantastic. Bedford was another one who was just like, my God, it's not shocking if you look back at it now. Brady Hoke, we talked to for this book. Most of the staff, Terry Malone. Unfortunately, I don't think we were able to talk to Mike DeBoard in time. He was, he felt ill. So hopefully he's, our thoughts are with him either way, but we weren't able to talk to him, but we did talk with some of his family. So we were able to get a good glimpse at the whole staff too. Like, what the guys were thinking, what was going on there. And it's just a fascinating group of people.
I have not gone back, and I've got the 97 Rose Bowl in the back here, but I don't know if I've ever watched that game again. And I was going to go back and start looking at some things to ask you. And then I said, it would probably be best if I just went with my memory, although it could be off. The other game that was, I don't know, hairy for Michigan was at home against Iowa.
Right.
And Tim Dwight, right before the half, took a punt back, and it completely took the air out of the stadium. Everybody was kind of like, oh, no. And if I remember, could have been third, could have been fourth quarter. It was a key drive that Michigan was into Hawkeye territory, and Greasy threw the ball to Ty Street short of the first down. It was something like 3rd and 10, but he wasn't on the move. He was like sitting there on a curl route or something like that. And there was pass interference. So if they let him catch it, and they got two guys right there, they tackle. Michigan's going to have to punt, or maybe they kick the field goal. I don't remember, but I always remember afterwards. So I go, oh, what a break. You get the breaks, but that game was big for Michigan. You're going to have those when you have an undefeated season,
That was the big circle game before the year, I think, for those guys internally to say, like, I think inside they all thought they were able, physically and, capable of doing anything they wanted to against anybody in the league. But Iowa was the team that they were always, I think, maybe more worried than people realized, because they knew in so many years they'd go through there, even during some of the Schimbecker years, they go through there without the fundamentals and without, making sure that every, T was crossed, I was dotted, the whole thing, and they would get beat, and it would ruin a season. And it happened more times than anybody cared to remember. And I think a lot of those guys knew that. They all had the thing. The other thing too about that era, that was the 96 seniors, Dennis. That was the first group in like 20 something years that had left Michigan without a Big Ten title ring. Like this was hanging. The pressure of like not screwing this up was a huge deal. That was the worst half Greasy played, in that whole season, the first half there. We talked to him quite a bit about, his situation in the locker room, talking to the team and what went on in there at halftime, what did go on. And then, the defense did its job again that day, because I think it was special teams and the turnovers that put them in terrible spots. But that was the second half there where Greasy was able to become, an NFL player, I think, and really surprised a lot of people, because everybody sort of had him tossed aside, I think, when 96 ended, but even before 97, So I think that was really the change that everybody else outside of Ann Arbor said, okay, well, I see now why they went with this guy, and, maybe they have a chance.
Well, he's a story in and of himself. I mean, I threw him
Yeah,
aside
fascinating.
after he threw that chair through the scorekeeper's
Right. And we
window,
talked to him about that. Yeah. Right.
and then he comes all the way back, and it wasn't like anybody was thinking, oh, Michigan, he was a preferred walk on.
No. Yeah.
He's around saying, oh, Michigan's really got it going at
Because
quarterback, and
Greasy's there. Right. Yeah, no.
we do have
Yeah.
some feedback coming in. And Jason, Michigan was undefeated last year, and it's different times now,
That's
but
true. Yeah.
JP is saying 97 was a great year for the history book, pun intended. He
Hmm.
gives you some congratulations
Thank
on the
you.
book
Thank
coming
you.
out. He says, "Do you believe that 144, that must be the season upcoming, statistically will be a better team than 97?" So, not asking you to predict the record or winning a championship, but he's talking about statistically, Michigan didn't have a
Statistically speaking,
1,000-yard rusher in
no, they didn't.
in
So
97.
offensively, yeah, I think that they will certainly have the chance to be better. Defensively, I don't know if Michigan will ever have another one like that ever again, like that ever. They came close a couple times to matching a few of those numbers. Um, and whether it be Madison or Don Brown, some of those defenses where they would just beat the tar out of remember the years where they'd dominate the lesser opponents, they'd have rough days against the better ones, and they still didn't even come close. There was a couple years where they had like 3 or 4 straight shutouts, and they weren't coming close to some of the yards per attempt allowed, some of the points per game allowed. And it's a different era of football, of course. Teams were heavier back then. They weren't as spread out. Things started to change within probably 2 years after that. But in terms of front seven versatility and just two corners that can just take everything away, I don't know if they'll ever have that again. This team could be close, but I don't know if it'll quite match it. Like Marcus Ray used to say that a lot to me, and I didn't believe him when I was young. Like they'll never have one like that, and I was like, oh, okay, Marcus, you talk a lot, right? But
Yes, he
like
does.
you know what? Looking, you give Marcus his full credit. We talked to him for the book, and it was like you're 100% right. Like the level of depth and talent and just everything across the board that 97 group had on defense is not going to be matched, I don't think, in our day, especially with the game that's played now.
If they didn't give up the 51 points, I know the offense gave up 2 of the touchdowns. They ended up, I don't
Right.
know, number 6, I think, in points, but they were on their way to being a pretty. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously,
And Michigan's had some great defenses that I covered, and they were outstanding with amazing NFL talent. And I just don't think it's quite as good.
Nick. So yeah, the next year they went to the BCS, so we were deprived of being able to see Michigan,
Yep.
Nebraska, and I'm sure
That's
every
right.
one of those guys, they all wait, tell Scott Frost to go to hell, and all Michigan fans hate Scott Frost. And back then, Lloyd was so big on not,
Yeah.
promoting Woodson
Uh-huh.
for the Heisman, and he wasn't going to politic or say anything about. And meanwhile, Nebraska, they could keep their mouths shut
Right.
about,
Right.
hey, we're the
Yep.
best, and everything else. So when you go back and you look at it with
Hmm.
almost 3 decades now, I always would say that it'd be a great game and everything else, but Michigan went on, and the defensive talent that they
Exactly.
put into the
Yeah.
NFL, and
It's
you don't
ridiculous.
really have that when you look at Nebraska.
No.
That's, I don't know if that's a hammer in an argument or anything else for
I think that
Wolverines and
that's
Huskers.
that's what got overrated or underrated about Lloyd's teams in so many ways is that they were dominant in the trenches and they didn't try to overwhelm you if they didn't have to or do something that was like embarrassing to you on the scoreboard if they didn't have to. And they played in platoons and waves and they subbed a lot. And it was like they just grinded the game out and played a pro style offense that nobody else really did. All of their guys were ready to play in the NFL way more than most other teams. Ohio State and Notre Dame are like the only comps in that era. We have a stat in the book somewhere, and I can't remember off the top of my head, of the number of guys that played in Super Bowls that played on that 1997 Michigan team. And if you take Tom Brady out, that number is still ridiculous.
Woo!
And the number of Super Bowls they played in, right? It's just, for like 20-year stretch. And it's all these guys that knew how to win. And I would have a very hard time picking against them. And I know that Nebraska rolled everybody. They rolled over a heartbroken Peyton Manning, right, in his last game and everything else. But I just don't know how you're solving anything against Michigan's defense that year, especially because they would have been mad. They would have been like, "Why are we having to prove any?" Like, could you imagine? Some of those guys like Marcus and those guys like, "Why are we having to even do this?" They would have been pissed, and it would have not. I don't think it would have gone. I think Michigan would have won the game. I have a hard time, and it's not just because I talked to all these guys, but I just have a hard time with that because I think the lines are so much different.
Yeah, well, the times have changed. We said that, we all know
They
that,
have.
but if you go back then, the writers that voted, or the media that voted, they used to like draw a line in the sand. They did not like jumping teams. If you were
No.
there, it was very difficult. I like that,
Yeah.
now that, voters will say, hey, look, I had them number
A
one.
little more
Like,
grace here. Yeah. Right.
I might have Michigan number 2, but I'll take the Florida State LSU winner this year, and I'll put them at number 1 after week 1. That's the way I would do it. And back in '97, if you were doing something like that, you'd say you're dope. You'd never do anything like that. And a lot of the Michigan, fans, that's why they were. It was like Tom Osborne, the head coach at Nebraska, was getting a going away gift because he was retiring.
Gift, yeah. Mm-hmm.
He was
announced late in the season, like during the whole and it was kind of like one of those. The gap between Michigan and Nebraska at the poll set, before when they were both 11-0 or whatever it was, or before the bowls, was like so much wider than it ended up. They lapped them at the end, or they got just barely in front of them in the coaches poll. So clearly, the AP poll didn't change. The writers all still thought Michigan was clearly the better team. Nothing really changed there. And the coaches, enough of it changed, just barely. And, that's, yeah, I mean, I think that, and that again, like, a lot of those guys were mad about that still were, and they were mad about it at the time, furious, and still furious about it. And but I look at it as I say, like I try to tell a couple of them, like, that team, your team and situation, it changed the sport. It literally it disrupted, and that change was probably coming, but that was the last straw that year. This can't happen again. Clinton joking on the White House, maybe we should have it out at the Rose Garden. Like, we don't need to be doing this anymore. Like, there's an easier way to do this. And it's a tough, asterisk to be part of it, but it's also an interesting one, I think, that, from my perspective, is just fascinating.
Yeah, well, Michigan fans, I don't know if you have to be a historian. Maybe you go back, and Michigan fans like to point out that the early 70s, they had those great teams, yet they weren't able to go to any bowl games.
Couldn't go to a bowl game.
Finally, they're like, well, that's what Michigan go play Oklahoma. They changed the bowl system up, and I think that had a lot to do with it as well. This is really July talk here, but somebody earlier this week had asked me, do I think that JJ McCarthy will it be a big deal that he's not going to go to Indy to be part of the media days? Michigan is sending Corum and Sainristil and Chris Jenkins. And I said, nah, I don't think so. And I said, in 97, Greasy wasn't the captain.
No.
And, that was the only thing that I could think of, or that maybe McCarthy, like, look, he's not a captain yet. And so, it's an honor there. And, Corum is so decorated. I don't know how.
I think that's a unique situation for a couple of reasons, right? Like, number one, captains in today's football are not quite the same as they were 20 years ago. Like, Cade McNamara transferred. He was the captain, transferred in the middle of the season or whatever it was, right? Like, things happen. Like, it's just a different deal these days. Two, Michigan has all of those, like you said, Dennis, they got all these guys who are still there that are like seniors and have been there, and he's not one yet. So you're going to vote. Is he going to be there over Corum? No. Is he going to be there over Sanders still? Absolutely not. You can name a couple other guys probably too. Some of the linemen, Zinter or Keegan, some of these guys. I mean, but, I don't think JJ's going to complain about that either. That was always overrated, in my opinion, who got brought to it's usually a present for the seniors. They get the trip to Chicago, and they get to have a nice steak, and then they go home. That's it. That's like the whole thing.
Well, tell Michigan and Michigan State fans when Connor Cook wasn't, elected.
I know. And then he wasn't elected, and it was like, I feel like it almost like by happenstance, it maybe worked out that he was like a whatever type of guy. But sometimes that happens. And it works out. Like, if the quarterback is the right guy for the team. But I mean, look, last year, what was JJ's record? Everybody seemed to get behind him just fine. So I don't think there'll be any problem with that.
Yeah. So Derek has a question for you. He's happy to see you. He's been following you for years on your old podcast. Bring it back. I think you can talk about the podcast that you have. I know you have one now currently. The question that I don't know the answer to, will your book be available on Audible? And would you narrate it? There you go. Let's go.
I am not going to narrate it, but yeah, at some point, yes, we will have an ebook and an audiobook once the publish date has come, and we'll get the release out and everything else on that. But yes, that will happen at some point. I will not be reading it, but I'm hopeful that we'll see who does read it. I'm not making any promises yet, but we've had some conversations. That could be a fun one before it's done. But yes, the plan is to have an audiobook and an ebook as well. And if it, we'll see about a paperback. I'm not sure. We haven't gotten that far yet. We're just on the hardcover stage right now. As far as the podcast goes, the only podcast I have right now is my Lions show with Colton Pouncey one of these years. I don't have any college football shows right now, although I may have a draft prospects. I'm not sure coming up. We'll see. But right now it's only Lions, which is fine. I don't need more than one podcast at the moment.
I don't know. I know, sometimes you get in and people start asking you things. You're like, I don't do that, but if I had to say, who's going to win more games this year, the Lions or Michigan, what would your answer be?
Well, probably. Look, I mean, Michigan probably, because I don't know if the Lions can get to 12 or. I mean, Michigan's I think a 10 or 11 team, right? I think that's a safe-ish bet. They're loaded. They have a ton of talent. This is the deepest the lines have been, offensive and defensive lines, I'll say, since Harbaugh's been the coach. In terms of NFL talent, they have guys that will not start or play a lot this year that are going to play in the NFL, which is something that a lot of Michigan fans remember from this book, that era. And that has been something that we, I think, as close observers of Michigan over the years, have seen the slow progression of that, but it's officially like here now. I would be very surprised if Michigan does not have a very, very good year and is not very similar to what we just saw a year ago. Like the stuff that they lost is replaceable. It's replaceable. I mean, it's not like you hate to say that, Olu and these guys were really good players for them, but like they have guys that can step in and do the job now. And I think that that's the difference. When you looked at like Hoke's teams and some of Jim's early teams, they didn't have that. They did not have the ability to roll year over year. And I was actually talking to somebody about this the other day about the portal and how Michigan attacks that and what they've done there. A lot of people love it. They're taking NFL guys out of the portal and they're just plucking like 5 or 6 or 10, whatever, and they're done. They're just taking like studs right away, these linemen that are like advanced and ready to go. And like, Harbaugh jokes about the recession-proof thing, and I don't know if I buy that. Like, I don't think that that's true, but this year's team is hard. It would be hard for me to see a scenario where they're not good. We're not competing for that title because they've got a lot. Ohio State would have its work cut out with them, I would think. I would have to pick Michigan if you're doing it right now because of everything they have, right?
Well, I would agree with you there. So they're very good. I would agree on paper. So here's the question. Do you see, I don't know, what are some of the similarities from 97? I haven't talked to all those. You do the book and then this upcoming year. Are there some?
Yeah, there, I found similarities in these last couple teams with that because I think they've formed this bond together where they don't really care much about anything. I think it was Sainer still a couple years ago had said, they changed the sign on the wall more or less. It wasn't those who stay will be champions. It was like, I don't remember what he said, but it was more or less like stay if you want to and you'll be here forever or whatever it was, or on the wall and we'll be family forever. It was like this familial shift that happened during the Harbaugh era. And that was like the hallmark of Lloyd Carr. That was like how they were able to grind through the tough moments. And you could see Michigan's teams 2021, 2022, they did that. They were able to they didn't finish it the whole way, but they were able to do some things that I don't think we've seen from a Michigan team in many years, many years. We used to talk all the time. Every year I would write about, they haven't beaten a team on the road worth a damn since like 1990, whatever, and like that's all gone now. And I think that a lot of that is guys like Corum and Sainer Still and Mike Barrett and guys that like really have seen this place on its ass and took it upon themselves to pick it up and do something about it. And it's like, that's the parallel to me is they really do seem like a very close group, and having Corum back, I feel like is just gigantic. And those linemen, Keegan and Zinter and some of those guys, just massive because I think that attitude is recyclable and, you can lose guys and just keep it going. That's what Michigan had for a time and they lost it. And, it takes a while to get it back, but like this feels like possibly the start of churning that back up again here a little bit. And I would expect them to be good.
There you go. You see the book Mountaintop. Well, that's Nick at the end, how I saw that you can pre-order it on Amazon, the inside story of Michigan's 97 national title climb. When Michigan was able to get Blake Corum back with, I think, name, image, and likeness, I thought they went and put a sign up. Those who stay will be compensated. They were able to bring so many players back. But, Michigan fans, and I think for good reason, when they look at recruiting high school players, they don't like name, image, and likeness because they think everybody's offering money up front or signing bonuses. And so they're missing out on the top 100 players, but currently being able to retain their star players, it's worked great. I don't know, Nick. Here's the off-season $1 million question for you. The way Michigan's playing their NIL, do you think it's sustainable? Because this year it's loaded, but are you going to be able to get JJ McCarthy or the next Donovan Edwards?
I think it is sustainable if you finish the job and deliver here. If they win a national title, yes, because I think it'll take care of itself. This is how Saban, and not really anybody else, but really Saban, did what he did at Bama. He was able to get all the guys that were juniors that could have gone pro to stay. That happened year after year after year. Guys that a lot of people never heard of. Linemen, linebackers, corners, guys at critical spots that had a chance to go get drafted and be like a third-round pick or whatever it would be. Some of them higher, but a lot of it would be like a middle-round draft pick, and they would go because they didn't want to come back and deal with it or whatever. Saban changes that, and you can guess anything you want about how he was able to change that, NIL before NIL, whatever. But the strategy there at the beginning was make sure we are always old in the lines and always talented, and then we could be attractive to a younger recruit. We could be attractive to a quarterback. You're never going to get beat up here. You're never going to play behind a bad line here, and then it takes care of itself. However, Saban's teams won the title; they finished, and that's the big thing in recruiting that I always saw. You cannot get there until you do something like that. You have to cross a line of you're really good to you're just elite. You're Georgia or Bama. That's just how it goes now. And so until you finish it, I don't know if they'll be able to have some of those breaks in the high school recruiting, but I would probably advise them to continue sort of doing what they're doing, because if you stay old, you'll be okay. Like you'll be in every game. If you're well coached and old, you'll be in every game. And we'll see about the playoff, but that's really what everybody asks for around here anyway, for the most part.
Yeah, sounds good to me. Winning too,
winning is good, but I mean that's what you ask for: be in every game and have a chance to win. And if you're well coached, you're right there.
I thought that was a Michigan shirt at first, but no.
Thanks, Jason.
Nirvana.
Yeah.
Nick, so if you want to get your hands on the book first,
right?
How do you do that?
We can go to Michigan1997book.com. Right now, there's a pre-order link there. You can go to Amazon, search it on there, Mountaintop, or search my name or Mark's name. Should pop up there. Also, the MDen, we've got it up there at the MDen right now. We did a pre-sale order with them. Believe we'll be doing something with the MDen at some point in August, hopefully, where we'll unveil it. And I'm sure Mark and I will be around the stadium as well this year. So if you're tailgating, we'll have some books in hand, and we'll be out with a little hut somewhere, or a tent or something, I guess. And looking forward to seeing everybody and get back around. I wasn't around much last year. I was writing this book and doing some other things. So it's exciting to get back around and see some people again.
Good. We appreciate your time. Where would you vote Michigan if you had a vote in the preseason poll? Maybe you do have a vote. I don't know.
I don't, thank God. Not anymore. Where would I vote them?
Because I would vote Georgia 1 and Michigan 2.
I would have a hard time putting them anything lower than third. I think I think Georgia has to be 1, and I think that there are other teams in that conversation. Like Bama is still very, very talented and very good. Texas is going to be good. Ohio State's going to be good, and TCU still got some good football players. But Michigan is still, to me, they're there. They've earned that right to be right there. I think, no worse than 3, probably 2. And I think that speaks to where they're at. And that's Harbaugh's maybe ahead of his skis on the recession-proof stuff. But for these last couple of years, they've done it pretty well. They've got to retain the people here. Whenever Sharon Moore decides to, go be a head coach somewhere, maybe they would hope it's here at Michigan. But those are things. But right now the staff is, I think, terrific. It's one of the best teaching staffs. I cover draft picks all year now. I mean, Michigan's up there with anybody in terms of fundamentals. All their guys are polished. You don't worry about any of the technique stuff with any of them. And I think that reputation holds up too. So they're in a good spot right now, a much better spot than 3, 4, or 5 years ago, whatever it was. And it's a testament to everybody in there.
It sounds great. All right, Nick, best of luck. I think, I'll go back and say what Jansen said. I'm predicting a big hit,
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yes. I'm glad. So now that John has said that, we're all set. Yeah.
I know it's going to be a big hit. All right.
Yeah.
Best of luck to you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, sir.
And I'll look forward. Maybe after reading the book, I'll be able to come back.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, we'll do it again.
Talk with you. All right. Take care.
All right, Dennis.
There he is. Nick Baumgardner joining us here to talk a little Michigan football. I didn't put all of your questions up. Sometimes when I go through them, I feel like, I did put a lot of those up there. Like, here's Antoine talking about it's like the old days. Michigan will have veterans on the field almost every year. That's the idea. I think hopefully what's going to happen here. Scott was talking about the 97 team was the only team ever to overachieve, unranked to start the season. Michigan was ranked 14th. If my memory, and I guess I'm going to have to look at, no, I don't have to look it up. They were 14th in the preseason. Now, 2 years ago, the 21 year, Michigan was the first unranked team ever to make the college football playoff. And then last year, TCU was the first unranked team ever to make the championship game. But, Michigan, the only team to overachieve. I don't know. Like, maybe I want I think Harbaugh's first year. I don't know if I was expecting him to come out of the gate, but I don't know. Like, I think that's an interesting one to think about, overachieving. I do think, like, with Antoine's talking about, like, the old days, and when we talk about Michigan right now, Jim Scarcelli, who's going to join us tomorrow, there was one point this summer I said, oh, yeah, Scar, this is a unique time in Michigan football, this upcoming season. And Scar's like, no, this is the way it used to be. And there's a point to that. From 69 through the 2007 season. Now, I started remembering Michigan football in the late 70s, but every year it felt like Michigan was a couple plays away from possibly going undefeated. And that was a testament to the kind of program that they were. Now, yeah, we know they did it one time. We get that. And there were a lot of, but it felt like that. And then there was Rich Rod and Hoke, and now Harbaugh was, the Grand Slam hire. It was like, this is going to be back to the old days. And it took longer. And it took almost so long that Harbaugh was almost shown the door. I know I'm laughing now, but it's true. But where they're sitting right now, they're sitting in a really good spot. And that's the point on that. All right. Thanks to Nick Baumgardner. We'll be with you coming up tomorrow. I know there was a question that was asked here by Gary, if I'm going to go back to 5 days. I mean, I feel like it, I feel like maybe I need to get out there and look at it. And, the way people show up and consume the podcast, it makes me feel good about, like, if I was showing up here and nobody ever wrote anything in, I'd be like, I don't know, should I really be doing 5 days? Maybe 3's the sweet spot. But Michigan fans have an appetite in July that in a thirst for Michigan football news that cannot be quenched with the season. It's still a ways away. So yes, all the time, every time, talk about Michigan and get in here. And that is my point here, finally, to tell you that if you are starving for Michigan content and you're always wanting, you wake up and you're seeing maize and blue. It's a beautiful day. Well, the way that you can quench that thirst is by joining up the Maize and Blue Review, because each day there's the beautiful pure water that will quench your thirst of thinking about, I'm thirsty for Michigan football. And there it is. Same thing on the hunger side. Join the Maize and Blue Review today. Go to michigan.rivals.com, and that's how it'll get done. Tomorrow, Jim Scarcelli will join us here. And anything that's going on certainly with Michigan and the rest of college football, we'll talk about. Until then, at 1 o'clock, give us that. Thanks for those 5-star ratings and the reviews. Continue those, the thumbs up button and all that. Those things are all appreciated.